first presenter of today is Bryon Maxey. Bryon Maxey holds an MA in Modern Middle Eastern and North African Studies from His professional and academic career includes multifaceted experiences as a pre-college educator, multi-faith community organizer, and project facilitator of digital learning at Most formative to Bryon's role as an educator were his first teaching experiences in Chicago and Detroit in secondary social studies. At the post-secondary level, Bryon has played a key role in launching several groundbreaking learning initiatives at Currently, he provides leadership to a large team regularly engaging with thousands of global learners in UM's open online learning experiences. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Bryon to the podium. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, you can go ahead. Of course, it didn't. Is there an easy way to share the updates that I made, or is it going to be? It's the same presentation. I thought they would carry over. I'll just have to bring it up on the computer. Actually. Okay, I'm sorry about that. No, it's all right. Okay. Do you have? It's a Google Slides. Oh, if we could, we'd have to download it and bring it back up on the computer. Don't worry about it. Okay. Okay, we'll make it work. All right, thanks so much. I appreciate it. Here's a remote click. Yep, thank you. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, doing great. All right. And is it showing? Okay. All right, awesome. Thank you so much. All right, and good morning, everyone. So thank you very much for the very kind of humbling introduction, Rima. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you all today. As a teacher, I can definitely appreciate having opportunities like this and hope that what I'm able to share with you today ends up being valuable and beneficial to your learning and your students and just enriching us all today. So basically, I've been charged with kind of giving an introduction. There's going to be a little bit of a audible during a portion of my presentation because I was charged with giving a broad introduction to Islam, but I also want to make sure that I cover the Middle East, North Africa region. So there was a couple of media assets that I incorporated a little later to make sure I focus on the Middle East and North Africa as well as a part of this presentation. So I just wanted to give that little clarification which was the reason for the pause to start here. So first thing here, just to introduce this slide. So we're introducing the topic of Islam as a religion and as a social cultural institution that affects, nearly 2 billion of the world's population. Yes.
Sorry, would you do us a favor?
Yes. Directly into the mic. Yes. Absolutely. No problem at all. And so this is an introductory piece. So this is not going to be comprehensive by any means because you could have an entire course. You can have an entire program, which we have here at U of M, where you can study and not comprehensively understand the religion. And so this is just a basic introduction to give us some foundational concepts to understand. And if we look at this term up here, the Arabic, that's just the word of how you would see it in its Arabic form, al-Islam, and that's just literally just referring to it in its Arabic form. So first, I haven't outlined this in terms of objectives like you normally would in the classroom, but I still will introduce what I hope you all will be able to gain from this today. I've arranged it in a series of questions, and I followed a certain book that I found to be particularly useful. I wasn't able to bring extra copies, but I'll share it today because it's a good resource. It's about 70 pages. You don't have to read it all. It arranges this kind of discussion and conversation in the form of questions. And so it's something that you want to have for your own edification as a teacher or something that you want to share with your, I would say, upper middle school to high school level students. It's a great resource that can be shared, and I'll make sure to pass it around. It's just called Understanding the Islam and the Muslims, and we can dive into that a bit more later. And so the two framing questions for the conversation today, introducing you all to Islam, is first, what is it? What is Islam? And obviously the goal for you all to be able to do today, for those of us that are not as familiar, is to be able to leave today with a basic understanding of what Islam is, right? So that's the first kind of, if you look at it as an objective as teachers, and how to convey it in some way to your students. So what is Islam? The second piece is understanding Islam, and I'm using Islam in two ways, and I'll get into that as we discuss. Understanding Islam broadly speaking. So not just in its literal terms, not just in its religious manifestations, but also in the broader context of what that might encompass. And obviously, understanding Muslims. Muslims being the followers of the Muslim faith, of the Islamic faith. So I've started off here by framing us with this question, as I mentioned. And we'll begin here with a particular verse from the Quran that's considered to be, the Quran being the holy book, and we'll get into what the Quran is in more detail in a moment, but a particular verse that speaks specifically to how most Muslims understand what Islam means. This is considered to be the verse that describes it in its kind of complete form. And so I'll let you, I know you all can read here, so I'll just focus on the last part. Okay, so for this final portion, and have approved for you as religion submission, you'll find literal translations of the word Islam as being submission. And you'll find some forms of it that are kind of hysterical and use that in really kind of clearly malintended ways, but the actual meaning is a specific kind of submission, and submission to the will of God. That's what it's meant in terms of the holy book of the religion and in terms of Muslim belief. And this particular verse is referring to one of the last sermons given by the Prophet, peace be upon him, of Islam before his death. And this was considered to be the final kind of piece confirming what all was revealed before that as describing Islam in the holy book, the Quran. And so here, this is just in bulleted form. I'm not going to read this here because you all can see this, but just want to kind of cover, when we look at Islam beyond the terminology, looking at it more broadly speaking, how we can better understand what it means. So first and foremost, in terms of faith, in terms of religion and believers, it's a fifth of the world's population. And this is 1.8 billion people approximately, and it's expected to go beyond a quarter of the world's population, probably could be in a week, could be today if you were to fully count it. So it's between 20 and 25%. And it's the fastest growing major world religion. In terms of belief, in terms of Muslim belief, Islam does not see itself, and Muslims do not see it as a new religion. It's considered to be the ancient way of believing and worshiping God, and that the Quran, the holy book, which again we'll get into a bit more detail on what that is considered to be a confirmation of all scriptures, of all religious truth that came before it. That's the way that Islam sees itself. And finally, and as I said here, and then the book that this is revealed in, and when we say book, that has certain limits to it, because in its first form, it wasn't an actual book. When we say book, we're referring to something physical like this. It was a few, maybe 20 to 30 years before it actually was in a single codified book. When it refers to itself as a book, this is something that was revealed to the Prophet through this angel Gabriel, which is shared amongst the Abrahamic faiths, who was shared, alayhi salam. And so when we refer to the Quran, it's what was revealed to the Prophet through this angel in the Muslim belief from God. And so just to kind of circle back to the global population and in terms of the diversity of Muslims around the world, if we look here at largest Muslim populations and the projections that we have for the future, we see that the Middle East, the birthplace, the center, the home of Islam, is a little bit farther down in terms of representation here. We have Indonesia, which we'll be focusing more on later this evening. We have India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria. So the first 5 most populous Muslim countries in the world, none of them, including Pakistan, is are in the Middle East. So that's just one thing that kind of gives you an idea of the global breadth of the religion in terms of population, in terms of Muslims. And then you'll see there's a stronger concentration, Egypt, Iran, Turkey, Algeria, Iraq, beyond that point. So there's definitely still a large and significant influential Muslim population in the Middle East. So then circling back to this conversation about what does Islam actually mean? So again, as I referred to earlier, it means submission in the Arabic form, to submit. And it also has etymological and linguistic connections to the word salam, peace. They have the same root, the same jadr as we say in Arabic. And so there's a certain kind of meaning that's not even more than implied. It's in the actual wording that suggests that submitting to God is a form of self-peace, of internal kind of purification and making peace. And then again, it means submission to the will of God. So then if we were to step back and kind of take all this back in, when we think of Islam and what it means in its most basic form, submitting to the will of God, and then for the world's 1.8 billion Muslims, it is submitting to the will of God as a way of representing God's truth in the Quran as the most complete and final scripture that confirms all that came before it. So that's kind of a summative way of thinking of what is Islam in terms of Muslim belief and practice. So this here, I'm not expecting you to read this all here, but I wanted to use a kind of a primary source example here. This is a translation from a medieval Muslim scholar. So he's considered to be one of the first scholars of religion. So we hear about religious studies in the academic context. Well, it's been going on for a very long time. It's not a 20th century creation or invention. It's existed for a long time, and it can be done within the faith-based context because many religious studies programs are found in Catholic or Protestant universities and also in public universities, so it's a common practice. And this scholar, Asharastani, had a very open, wide-ranging view on religions writ large versus not religions. And then he refers to a specific verse from the Quran to describe Islam in this great family of religions of the world. And so I'm just going to point us to this last portion because, and I'll summarize what he says above, but you all can read it for yourself if you want to look at it more closely as I speak. He's describing religion, separate from describing Islam, as anyone that submits to something beyond their own ideas, right? So someone that is willing to submit themselves to the wisdom, the knowledge of something else, something greater. And so then for him, and so the reason why I bring up this figure is because at his time in the 12th century in Persia, he's cataloging every single religion that's known to Muslims at the time. So this is in India, this is in Africa, this is in Europe, and even all the small sects, he's writing them down, he's describing this is what they believe, this is what they believe, this is what they believe. And then he says at a certain point in the book, and Islam, religion with God is Islam. And I just brought the Arabic up here because this is from a Quran from West Africa, and you can see the Arabic of that specific verse. Just to give an example of, this is a part of the Quran, but it can be found, these holy texts, in manuscript form, which means it's written, so this is a primary source, all across the world. It's a common tradition, a common trend across the Islamic world. And this speaks specifically to how a Muslim might identify what the religion is from its primary source, its sacred text, the Quran. And so just to kind of go back into the example I gave, these two here are examples of Quranic texts from different parts of the world. This one here is the one I mentioned from West Africa. It's from northern Nigeria. And this one over here is from Kashmir, which is on the border between Pakistan and India. And then we could find other examples from other parts of the world. And you can see the differences in the style, kind of the cultural inheritance, and how they kind of look. And these are manuscripts that can be found digitally through our very own library here, and this one through the library, the SOAS in London. And so to kind of dive into very quickly what the Quran is itself. So according to Muslim belief, it is a record of the exact word of God revealed to the Prophet Muhammad through this angel, Gabriel. And it was memorized by the Prophet. And then he dictated this to his followers, to his companions, or as we might say, as might be said in the Christian tradition, his disciples. And they wrote it down as scribes, and so in this sense, it was a book, but it was a book that was written on the bones of camels, on lambskin, on whatever was found around them, and then all of these scraps, all of these memories from these scribes were collected some years later to become the book that we now know as the Quran. That we knew that was known then as the Quran, but became like in the book form. And then lastly, it's because of this practice and because of the insistence of the Prophet to keep things preserved, for it to be recorded, for it to be stated as he indicated, it's been preserved word for over 14 centuries. And this is an example of this tradition continuing, this kind of scribal practice. This is a slate of wood. It's called lauch, and this is another example from West Africa. And this child here is in this process of memorizing and learning the Quran. And so he wrote this down himself, and it's a part of their practice of learning it. Well, they'll wash it off if they make a mistake, and then they'll write it back down again, and this is a part of their teaching and learning practice, traditionally speaking. And so the other big question, so who is Muhammad? And when we think about the Prophet Muhammad, to give ourselves a historical context, he was born, and it was believed around 570 in the Common Era in Mecca, the city in Saudi Arabia. Looked very different then than it does now. And he was orphaned at a young age. His father died before he was born, and then his mother died when he was like around, I think it was 8 or 9, but don't quote me on that, but he was very young. And so he was orphaned, so this is an important part of his experience. But he was still born into a respected tribe, the Quraysh, and his uncle was more or less the leader of the tribe. And so that was obviously an important figure to be orphaned to. He became known for his truthfulness, his sincerity, his honesty as he became older. And so what kind of led to this shift to prophecy is he would meditate regularly in this cave right above the city of Mecca, this cave of Hira. And in this cave, he was kind of struck by this surreal kind of divine moment, being squeezed by this angel, not knowing what's going on. He doesn't know it's an angel. So he's thinking he might be possessed, all these various things. When you find very rich descriptions of this in the Islamic tradition. And this is where he's commanded to read or recite in the name of his Lord. And that's the first verse that's considered to be given to him. And then from that, he's pretty much the prophet. And from this point on, he preaches in Mecca these messages of truth that come from these previous scriptures, but he's persecuted by the people of Mecca. And his message is if you think of, if we're familiar with the kind of the message of Jesus in terms of the corruption of the times and of what was going on in his land, it's a very similar message to what you would hear in Mecca, because it was a very wealthy trading city, and because of what was going on in the city at the time, there were practices that were part of the culture that the scripture was brought down according to the Muslims and the Prophet to kind of correct and give guidance to the people there. Because of this persecution, people had to leave. They had to first actually escape to Africa, some of them to Ethiopia, and then later they all joined together in the city of Medina. And this is the term Hijra, if you've ever heard of it, and that's the point at which the marking of the beginning of the Islamic calendar begins, when the Muslims migrate from Mecca to Medina. And just a quick thing, we're probably wondering, this thing next to Muhammad, you may have seen PBUH written in a textbook next to the name Muhammad, or you may have seen this in the Arabic. That's practice of custom of Muslim tradition to provide prayers or blessings on the Prophet whenever his name is spoken or uttered. So that's why you hear me say that. I am a believing Muslim. If you have questions about that, we can definitely discuss. So that's why I include it here, because even in writing, for some but not all, there are variations in the practice, something that some Muslims do. So what I wanted to do now, I wanted to give an opportunity for some Q&A. I actually had a link set up, so what I'll do instead of trying to, because I added the link to the slides, but I wasn't able to transfer over the updates. I'm gonna write it down. It's actually nice and short. I use tinyURL. And so the way this works is if you have questions throughout the presentation and you wanna kind of parking lot them, as you may do this practice in your class, there's a KWL, if you have your phones, that you can actually put them in, and I'll be able to see them as they come in. And as I have pauses like this, I'll stop and I'll give you time to ask questions. So I'm gonna write it down here. I'm going to write it down here. so like workshop. Okay. And so what I'll do just to make sure that we're being expeditious and judicious with our time is I'll continue. But if there's any questions now, I'll take any kind of extemporaneous questions while you all are getting a chance to log in. And then I have at least one or two more pauses like this, that way I can review the list later on. But are there any extemporaneous questions right now? And I can go back in slides. I can go back in the slides to answer questions or anything like that. Any questions right now?
Can you tell me the abbreviation again where you said the prayers and blessings?
Yeah, so there's...
I've seen that before in like student work.
It'll be PBUH in like the Latin script, or in PBUH, which means peace and blessings upon him.
Upon.
Yep. And then the Arabic is that up there. That's sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, which means the same thing.
Did everyone hear her question? Sorry, do you want me to? I was just asking what the abbreviation was for the prayers and blessings because I missed the upon him part. Thank you.
Yes. And there's also, so that it's not only a male thing, there's female versions of that as well. And there's also plural versions. So you'll hear people say, blessings be upon her, mercy be upon her. There's various formations of this for revered figures in the Islamic tradition. And then and this is one thing that's not well known even amongst Muslims. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is perhaps one of the most, if not in some cases the most revered amongst the Muslim figures in Islam. And in some cases, she's even considered to be a prophetess because in the Quran, God speaks directly to her. And according to some traditions, God speaking directly to you in a revelationary or in a kind of directionary form makes you a prophet. And according to some of these traditions, that would make her that. So just to give you an idea of so they would say, those that believe that, alayhi salam, alayha salam. So it's a term that applies across contexts. So going now into understanding Islam and the Muslims, and who are Muslims and what do Muslims believe. So the key thing that I've already kind of began to introduce is that Muslims are incredibly diverse. Diverse in terms of belief and practice, diverse in terms of geography, locality, and culture. So that's one of the most important things to keep in mind when you're thinking about Islam and Muslims. And that particularly when it comes to, if you call it practice, observance, there's a wide variation, and that there's not a single way in which a Muslim has to believe, is expected to believe, or will demonstrate belief, or non-belief, or non-practice, or whatever variety of forms. So that's one thing that's really important to keep in mind. What I am sharing is what is generally recognized as kind of common beliefs, but even within this, there'll be some variation. One of the reason why this beginning part of the presentation has focused so much on the Quran, the name Islam, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is because if there's going to be any kind of common factor that if you were to pull it out, everything would fall apart, it's those things. You can't have a definition of Islam without the text that Muslims consider to define it. You can't have Islam without the figure where the term is, where the book is transmitted to, and who the tradition is built upon. So that's where we kind of begin. And when we think about the great diversity that comes after it, in terms of beliefs, traditions, some would use the term sects or doctrines, they begin more or less after the death of the Prophet, okay? So when we talk about global Muslim diversity, we already saw this a bit earlier, so I'll just quickly move past this. This gives a kind of almost like a heat map of where there's high concentrations of Muslims around the world. So you get an idea here. The United States is also represented. When it comes to the different, what's used, sometimes you hear the term sects or doctrines in Islam. There's Sunni and Shia. This refers to one of the early kind of differences of opinion on authority amongst the early believers that led to conflict. And so there's Sunnis who believe in the community deciding on where authority and leadership should reside, and then the Shia believing that it should rest with the descendants of the prophet and his family and that family. So that led to a divide that's existed over time. Some of the conflicts that exist today are much less related to that actual doctrine, and more so kind of geopolitics and a variety of things, but that's where the beginning part of the kind of distinction began. And so if we want to really boil it down to what the primary thing is, it has to do with authority. And if you tie that thread, then yes, authority would be the thing that anyone would have conflict about. I want to be in charge, or no, I want to be in charge. And then there's a variety of beliefs and practices that build upon that lead to the differences that we see today. But there are still many commonalities in terms of belief and practice. And we're seeing here where you have the larger Shia populations of Muslims around the world. And if you were to represent this map, there's only a few countries that have Shia majorities or near majorities, and that's pretty much Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon is right around the border of being kind of nearly, maybe a plurality in Lebanon. Yes.
Are the Kurds Shia or Sunni?
They're Sunni. Yep. There's cultural traditions and kind of religious practices that are somewhat different than other Sunnis in the area, but they're still Sunni. Yep. So another one, this is a resource. I'll try to see if I can get these printed out later. I'm not going to read any of these. These are just descriptions of some of the great diversity of belief and practice. And so as a frame, the vast majority of Muslims would be considered traditional in terms of there being traditional Shia, traditional Sunni, and then there's a variety of schools of thought within those traditions themselves. And that's what this describes here. Then you have fundamentalism. And so fundamentalism is, when I say fundamentalism, I do not mean terrorism, just to be clear. Fundamentalism is the same concept that you would see when it comes to, and I'm not speaking ill of this person, just in terms of belief and practice, Jerry Falwell or some of the evangelical tradition. This is a shared kind of trend in terms of looking at the sources of a faith, wanting to kind of, in this belief of fundamentalists, clear out the things that have accrued over time that are wrong and look at their source and only follow that. So that's what would be considered fundamentalism. And then modernism is this idea of reconciling what the tradition says with the modernity of technology, of change, of culture. So these are kind of some of the trends. I don't fully accept this. This is not my exact framing or wording that I would use. I do think that the percentages are mostly accurate. I think the modernism one might be a little bit off, to be honest with you. But this is from a useful resource from the Royal Jordanian Institute, where they do a nice yearly kind of survey of the world's Muslims. I think it is a good framework to understand the broad kind of superstructure framework beyond Sunni and Shia. So when we look at Sunni, that's about 90% of the world's Muslim population. Some would say 80, like maybe less, closer to 85. And then when we think about within that context, there's this kind of, in American media, it's often like a boogeyman concept, Sharia, like Islamic law. All that means literally, and if you even translate the Arabic, it means street or way. And then in the religious context, it means a way of practicing, a way of following back to the practices of the prophet. And because it's possible to have differences of opinion and it be okay, it's actually one of the sayings of the prophet is that difference of opinion is a mercy. And so that's something that most Muslims overwhelmingly say, yeah, it's a good thing to have diversity as long as we're able to get along. So this is just an example of some of the different schools of law, the different ways of believing and practicing and having certain traditions of following. And these are the primary ones in the Sunni tradition. So the Shia population in the Islamic world is about 10% to 15%, mostly concentrated in the Middle East, in Iran, Iraq, a little bit through Syria, and into Lebanon. There's obviously other populations around the world as well. They're also global. And there's different branches of that faith as well. Not expecting you all to understand this, just wanted to at least lay it out. And then there's one other tradition that has endured over time that often gets neglected in these conversations, partially understandably because they're only about less than 1%. But if you've heard of the nation of Oman, they're not Sunni and they're not Shia, which is like, whoa, it blows some Muslims' minds. So like, oh, really? There's a tradition there called Ibadism, and they disagree with the conflict between the early proto-Sunnis and the early proto-Shia, and they said that, well, you treated the descendants of the Prophet wrong, we're just gonna leave, and we think that whoever's the most just should be in charge. This tradition evolved over time. It's not the exact same group it's not the exact same group or set of teachers, but people of that tradition, of that legacy, settled in Oman, and there's some of them also in North Africa, and what is today the branch of Islam called Ibadism. And then you may have heard of the idea of Sufism. I'm not gonna go super deep here either, but just to recognize that Sufism is not a single thing. There's a wide diversity amongst Shia and Sunni, and there's many different Sunni orders or like brotherhoods. This is a very rough analogy. The closest thing I can say is if you can imagine like Masons, Shriners, a fraternity and a sorority without all the alcohol, and kind of like doing like religious piety together. That's the best way of describing Sufism. I mean, it's a very rough analogy, just trust me, but it's just that's the closest thing I can give you in terms of analogy to the American experience. It's kind of brotherhood and sisterhood together doing pious things. Yes. Yes, actually, there's actually an Arabic term for that called a khanka. And there's another term as well, but in the Zawiya, those are actually like more or less the convents. Yep. You had a question?
Closely associated with Rumi?
Yes, so Rumi is a big Sufi. Yep.
Question was, is Sufism associated with Rumi?
Absolutely, yep. So Rumi is one of the most famous, I'm gonna say Persian/Turkish, because both nations claim him very strongly, and it's like fights that break out about this Sufi figure. So yeah, he's a very famous Sufi.
And actually, I neglected to say to everyone that we will give you access to the resources.
Oh, awesome.
So you don't have to take pictures and scribble notes.
Great.
Sorry,
Thank
I
you.
didn't say that earlier.
Yep. And also, just to clarify, these particular sets of resources, if you're teaching like maybe 11th, 12th, AP, these are you. I mean, you can still use them if you got advanced middle school students. More power to you. But these particular slides might be a little bit. I just wanted to make sure I gave this to you all to understand some of the context. Yep. All right, last thing. So, buzz topics: Iran, Saudi Arabia. What's going on there? So when we hear about, if you've heard of the term Wahhabism, that is the state practice. Can't say state religion. Their state religion is Islam, but that is the state form of or doctrine of religious practice in Saudi Arabia. It is a form of Islamic fundamentalism, and for the most part, that would be an accepted framing by the Saudis. It does have a traditional kind of lineage through a scholar named Abdul ibn Wahhab, but it is a form of fundamentalism because they emphasize looking back at the sources and not as much on the traditions that come after. Iran is another form of fundamentalism because their state was a very secular state up until 1979, and many of the population there weren't okay with that. There was a religious element. There was also kind of a not poor governance factor as well. So this is a good kind of connection to think about in terms of government. People think it's only religion. No. There was a lot of corruption. There was this massive $300 million gala for people from away from Iran that kind of was one of the catalysts for the revolution, right? So there's religion and there's also governance. And so revolutionary Shiism was born out of that era. They took some elements of kind of communist, like revolutionary ideas. They won't actively claim this, but in terms of like the global context of the time, this idea of it being revolutionary, that's where that framing comes in. But in terms of ideology, it's very much a fundamentalist, but still connected through a tradition, Shia orientation that leads to the state of Iran and its governance today. Okay, so this is the portion where the audible I was mentioning for context. I wanted to make sure that I kind of had a moment where I failed to realize how much I should be orienting you all to the Middle East and North Africa. The resources I have here are showing the global diversity. And so, how would I do this? I'm trying to think of the easiest way to, yeah. So these are not the right links though, that's the thing. So the edits I made had the links to the more. can still make it work, and then if we have time later, So what I'll do then, I'll just do this. We'll focus on Timbuktu in West Africa because technically it's a borderland. It is North Africa and the Middle East. It is shared by, it was founded by Berbers, which are the indigenous people of North Africa, but it was the trading post and it was ruled by West Africans that were considered, black in the kind of racial and historical. There's a whole lot of, we don't have time today to get into like the variations and definitions of race because it's really complicated, but it's a meeting place, a shared context that can help give us some information here. So we'll just look at this one and we'll kind of, the rest are useful, and if you can get the links, then I'll definitely share them, but we'll start here. So we're going from...
Lies Timbuktu is rich in history.
Okay. So when we think about West Africa, we think about orality and the lack of written history, but really different kind of culture. This is just kind of give us a little more context into definitely a lot of orality and kind of verbal tradition, but not well known is there's a strong written tradition that's pretty old.
History that contradicts a commonly held impression in the West that sub-Saharan Africa has only oral and no written traditions.
Avant la découverte de l'Amérique à la fin du...
Well before there was an America, Timbuktu was a thriving center of learning with a university. Professors were teaching philosophy, theology, mathematics.
Professor El Haj says the earliest records of Timbuktu go back to the 11th century, to a prosperous desert crossroads where salt, gold, slaves, and scholarship were exchanged. That all ended in the late 1500s with Moroccan invasions and later French conquest. Today, much of Timbuktu's architecture seems frozen, or more appropriately, baked in time. The distinctive Jingere Bear Mosque, built of limestone and mud, has been run by Imam Abramane Essayuti's family for generations. Islam is thought to have come to this region in the 8th century.
For us, this mosque is our heritage. Imagine, it was built in 1325, handed down to us by our parents. This mosque has been here for 700 years.
The 15th century Sankore Mosque was Timbuktu's nerve center of intellectual life.
In summertime, they give lecture here. You have a circle here, at least 40 or 45 or 50 students.
Well before Europe's Renaissance, students and scholars, as many as 25,000, came from West and North Africa and the Middle East to study Islamic law, theology, and a range of secular subjects. Today, the legacy of that scholarship lies in a vast, scattered collection of historical manuscripts.
Yeah, this is the library, and
The Ahmed Baba collection, named after a 15th century scholar, has some 40,000 manuscripts. Arabic was used for theological as well as secular works, testament to the Islamic world's leadership during the period in medicine and the sciences. Every now and then, there's a manuscript in Hebrew. This one is a 16th century letter by a Jewish trader writing home to Morocco about market prices in Timbuktu.
the Timbuktu is really a melting pot city, where we had Jews, we had people from North Africa, people from Sub-Saharan Africa, and all of them were living in peace here in Timbuktu.
So far, only a...
I'll stop there, and then, where are we? Here we are, okay. So I want to make sure we're staying decent on time. I'm only going to very briefly touch on Muslim diversity in America because Jay is going to do a much better job and more deeply later on. So I'm only going to quickly pass through this. Just an idea of the diversity in America. You have this here in terms of race, where they're born, where people are born, and in terms of generation of being Muslim. That third generation column, you see that it's mostly black because there have been Muslims here in the US that are African American since before the nation was founded, that were enslaved, but then there was a kind of a small break of about 25 years where people were kind of, you can't be Muslim anymore, or no, you can't practice, but then there was a revival in the early 20th century. So those third generation that are mostly black are from that tradition. So you've heard of the Nation of Islam, et cetera, et cetera. And also there was also Sunni Muslims early in the 20th century as well that were African American. This is where that comes from. So this, again, this shows the diversity of where people, the immigrant population of Muslims in the US, where they come from around the world. So you have a decent amount from the Middle East. In Michigan in particular, that figure is much higher. There's still a large South Asian population, but obviously it's well known that in Dearborn and also in Hamtramck, there are very large Arab American populations. But a large portion of that is also Arab Christian, but also a large portion is Arab Muslim. All right, so we're not going to have time for this today, nor that. Okay, so this exercise, there's one piece that I did want to show us, and then I'm going to let us dive into questions. It's going to be just a specific excerpt of this piece here. I saw there was a question about the holiday of Eid, so I want to make sure we capture at least a portion of that, and then we'll take the rest of the time for questions to make sure you all have the time, because I see a lot of really good questions have come in, and I want to make sure we have time to do them justice. So we're not going to do the full 9 minutes, just to be clear. And also, sorry, last thing, all these resources here on PBS Learning, I would say over 90% of them are excellent resources, and a lot of them have support materials, teaching guides, discussion questions, so definitely a good resource if you're trying to do something in class and not have to do a ton of work and research yourself. Awesome resource. All right, so apologize, it's a good video, but I'm gonna skip around a little bit to give us time for questions.
I hope it won't be too hard.
Okay.
But he's not fasting early. I hope it won't be too hard.
She's talking about Ramadan and fasting. She hopes it won't be too
Our
hard.
day started very early. Mom woke us to eat before the sun came up.
Nadia, time to wake up.
We ate a small meal and said our morning prayers. My little brother Adam is up with us, but he's not fasting. He's too little to fast. In Ramadan, we make special efforts to be helpful and kind to each other. We're supposed to do good deeds. My sister, Layla, is collecting money for an orphanage.
All right, Nadia, how many prayers have you done today?
3.
All right, let's mark it.
I keep a good deeds chart. Adam marked his good deeds with his star chart. He put stars on for helping Mom. He also tracks the moon. Ramadan starts with a new moon and ends with the sighting of the next new moon. The new moon is when it's just a sliver in the sky. Many people read the whole Quran during Ramadan. The Quran is the holy book for Muslims. We read a little every day. We read in Arabic. It won't be long now. The sun has set.
Allahu Akbar. Allah.
Dad makes a call to prayer. Now we break our fast. Most people break their fast by eating a piece of fruit, like a date. There's just a few more days left in Ramadan.
Okay.
Today is Eid.
All right, Adam, you have a 2-part present.
Around the world, Muslim children get new clothes, bags of candy, and sometimes small gifts, and money to spend later on treats. We all get dressed up. We're ready to go to the mosque. We say special prayers. We take time to remember the poor and remind ourselves to be grateful for what we have. Everyone is dressed in their best clothes. It is very colorful. Now is the best part.
All right, so I'm going to pause it here to give us time for questions and just give a little bit of framing to this video very quickly. I didn't go through the 5 pillars because I wanted to give an example that could at least demonstrate a few of them. And then also wanted to clarify that while the concepts in the 5 pillars of Islam, if you've heard of them, it's a fairly well-known thing, but these are the 5 core beliefs that the overwhelming majority of Muslims believe and follow. And in terms of like shared belief, more or less they're all believed, but there are variations in how people describe them. In the Shia tradition, there's kind of a couple of other ways of that might encompass 6 or 7, but they include those 5. So there's different variations on it, but overwhelmingly the 5 pillars is a way of thinking of it. 3 of them appeared in the clips that I showed you in the video. So I'll just kind of quickly overview what those 5 are. The first being the testament of belief, the Shahada, which is where Muslims say there's no God but God and Muhammad is his messenger, right? This is the most kind of fundamental thing for someone to become a Muslim. The second being prayer, this idea of prayer. You saw prayer in here. They woke up before the sunrise. And that's when you're thinking about fasting, which is, no, is it the next? The order doesn't matter. Then there's fasting. We saw prayer, we saw fasting, and then there's also this idea of charity. It doesn't really fully capture it. It's more like a wealth tax, to be perfectly honest with you. There's optional charity that you get blessings for that's included, but this idea that anyone that holds wealth for an extended period of time, they have to, is the due of someone who does not have wealth, that you have to give them a portion of your wealth, 2.5%. So that's the cast. So there's 1, the testament of faith. 2 is prayer. 3, fasting. 4, which we're not able to see here, is the Hajj, the ritual of the pilgrimage to Mecca. And I'm missing the 5th. I said, did I already say Zakah? Okay, and Zakah, the one I mentioned, right? And this is the custom of giving. It's obligatory. It's a more or less obligatory charity or wealth tax. But there's also what we call sadaqah. That's the optional kind where you're getting extra blessings for giving of your own will and volition. And the idea of zakah and sadaqah are both to purify yourself of whatever kind of blameworthy or kind of greedy things that you might accumulate on yourself by holding and being kind of miserly. Imagine like the Grinch. Like what he embodies, it's like to keep you from that. So I'll close the presentation portion with this. I apologize that I wasn't able to go more deeply into the Middle East and North Africa. I hope we can do that in the question period because some of the resources that I wanted to share, I'll find a way to get them to you all in terms of, because they're all the kind of case studies, they're all on PBS Learning. So there's a really good one on a girls' Quran school in Syria. Well, it's a somewhat sad story. It's no longer in Damascus. They had to move, but the story itself is compelling. And then there's like a follow-up link and resource that kind of describes like where's the family at now that ran the school. And then there's also a resource that I had that's on, what was the other one? I'm forgetting. It's a PBS series that they made in the mid to late 90s that describes the change in the Islamic world. Actually, the change around the entire world in terms of religious belief, where there was kind of that period of modernity and everyone being like, this is the modern world, we got to change with the modern world, and there being this kind of shift back in the 80s. We saw it across the world in the US with kind of the Reagan coalition, and we also saw it in Iran in '79 with the revolution. We saw it in Egypt, we saw it across the world, and it gives a framing in Turkey and Iran to that context. And it's a 5-minute clip that I was going to share, but you all can use the whole thing if you want. And then the last one, I think that's good enough for now, but I want to dive into questions. And I think I probably only have about 5 minutes, if that's right.